Hello, and welcome to our video looking at the Cold War in Europe. Now, I want to start by saying that this is just a really brief overview of the Cold War. There's a lot more specific events and things that happened in the Cold War, but for our purposes today, we're just kind of looking at the broad strokes. We're looking at what happened right after World War II, the events of the Cold War, different monetary systems and reforms that happened, and then what happens at the end of the Cold War. All right, let's dive into what's going on right here after World War II. At the end of World War II, we see a lot of tension kind of starting to rise between the Soviet Union and their Western allies. So remember, the big powers coming out of the end of World War II were the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, really, with the United States and the Soviet Union kind of being the leading figureheads. We'll see that the Soviet Union is going to advocate a lot for control over Eastern Europe, and you see the United States and Great Britain really seeking to keep control over Western Europe. One of the new things created at the end of the war is the United Nations. And the United Nations was created to try to help alleviate problems starting to arise between countries kind of before they get to larger issues. They are supposed to kind of model the League of Nations, but they're trying to make it a stronger version of that. One of the things that causes tension really early on is the idea of self determination for these countries that were taken over by the Nazis, but now we're going to have their freedom. So during the Potsdam Conference, we already saw some tension with this because Stalin was very reluctant to, agree to self determination for those Eastern European countries. He already has his eye on them to make them kind of satellite states of the Soviet Union. And so, in response to this, the United States issues what's called the Truman Doctrine, and it offers financial aid to any country that feels threatened by a communist takeover. So they'll pay them money to, help rebuild themselves and create a more stable government and country in return for not turning to communism. So what ends up happening is that countries that do fall into Soviet control became satellite states of the Soviet Union, and we refer to that divide between them as the Iron Curtain. At the end of World War II, the Allied powers realized, we really need to do something different than we did in World War I. We need to leave troops here in Germany to make sure that they stay kind of doing what they're supposed to be doing. We don't have this problem again. And so they had agreed before the end of the war to divide up Germany and each take a zone. But what ends up happening is that the Allied powers that have democracy, so France, Great Britain, US, they all agree to combine their zones into one big joint democratic, area. But the Soviet Union, they really want full control. And so they take their part and they partition uh, Berlin and actually like divide off Berlin into kind of the Soviet sector and they cut the city in half. And so we see that Western countries initially they try to kind of airdrop supplies to prevent them to giving into the Soviets, who would like cut off all of their materials and things. But what ends up happening is the Berlin Wall, where that wall will become kind of the physical representation of the Cold War in Europe. Another response to growing concerns about communism from the United States is the Marshall Plan. So the United States sees that, it can't just leave its allies totally alone against the threat of communism. And so it starts to send money in like aid to help Western Europe recover from this war, which is something they didn't do last time. So their major goal is to stop the spread of communism by offering economic incentive to countries that reject communist and really kind of socialist policies. So you can see here who kind of most benefits from this money. It's going to be like the United Kingdom and France, their two biggest allies, but it's also going to be places like Italy, Western Germany. So we'll see some new states really taking that economic aid from the United States. And this brings us to the actual kind of events of the Cold War. What are some of those key iconic moments? A lot of these key iconic moments are going to be represented by government sponsored propaganda. So the Cold War, it's an ideological fight. So a lot of it's done through propaganda. It's communism versus capitalism. And you see that both sides are going to use any means necessary to kind of spread these ideas. And we've got the first really examples here of mass media being used to spread ideas. We've got TV, we've got radio, we've got posters. We've got all sorts of different mediums now to show and spread ideas. Now, we call this a Cold War because the Soviet Union and the United States really aren't in battles directly against each other in like physical combat, but we have a lot of tension and a lot of rivalries that are developing throughout this time period. So the arms race is a great example of that. Now, the Soviet Union, once they realize kind of that nuclear technology, they're going to create and test their first atomic bomb in 1949. And this starts a nuclear arms race between the two sides. It's like who can create the most deadly stockpile of weapons. And we see it's not just arms, it's going to be also related to space as well. We see the first satellite launched, we have the first moon orbit, and then landing on the moon. The space race and the arms race are really closely connected. There are some examples of kind of more what we call hot wars or like direct conflict to talk about. They take the form of proxy wars where the United States and the Soviet Union are kind of battling each other indirectly through a different country's, war. So examples of that are things like Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. We'll see that the United States, they started with this policy called containment to try to stop communism. It's literally just to contain it to the area it's already in and keep it from spreading. They're afraid of what's called the domino theory. And they believe that if one Asian country, was to become communist, all of these other would follow, which is what prompts their presence in Korea and Vietnam. It's during this time period as well that we'll see new treaties and alliances being created. So this is where we get the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this is to kind of help Western European countries, the United States and Canada, band together to go against common enemies. And in response to this, the Soviet Union's like, well, you know what? We're just going to create our own group if you won't let us be in your group. So they create what's called the Warsaw Pact, and the Warsaw Pact is made up of all these different Soviet alliances kind of meant to do the same thing. And they also create what's called ComCon, which provides money from the Soviets to these countries to kind of like help them rebuild their economies as well. And so these organizations are going to lead to kind of a further divide between the split of capitalist and communist ideologies. But of course, not everyone in the world is trying to take part in this Cold War tension. We see the rise of what's called the non aligned movement. So there are several countries that'll stay out of this and they're not going to take a side with either, the Soviet Union or, the Western democratic countries. The most famous ones that are kind of known for working both sides and getting benefits from both are going to be India, Indonesia, and Yugoslavia. And that brings us to monetary systems and reforms. We'll see that economics kind of becomes more of a global rather than a national issue for a lot of these new alliance systems. They want to make sure that things like the Great Depression and then what occurred in Germany after World War One with all of the economic problems that they had don't happen again. So they create things like the International Monetary Fund to kind of help regulate the economy for people. And they want to facilitate currency exchange specifically. They're like, we should make it easy for us to know kind of the value of everybody's money. And the other thing that's created is the World Bank, and that's created to provide loans for trade and rebuilding in a lot of these war ridden countries from World War II. But we also see that lots of countries are doing things like signing trade agreements to lower tariffs and encourage more global trade. And this is where we'll see the rise of kind of globalization as we know it, a global economy. Another big example of monetary systems that are going to change is the creation of the European Economic Community, which is formed in 1957. And it's basically the precursor to the European Union that'll come out just like 2 decades later. It's often called the common market, and the whole idea is to promote free trade among member nations. These European nations, they realize that they are not the superpowers anymore. They are smaller, they have a lot less economic capital. A lot of them are starting to lose their colonies in the decolonization process, and they're not producing the kind of goods and things that they used to be able to do. And this helps them kind of have a more stable, and better bargaining economy than they would have before. And so the European Union or the common market, it's the largest free trade bloc in the world. It comes with a lot of different kind of side effects to it. Like there's lots of European nations that are kind of maybe resentful towards the kind of restrictions that they have for their country based on things that happen in the EU, which we'll talk about, in a later period. Western Europe is not the only place that is going to experience reforms and kind of new ideas coming about. So once Stalin is dead, His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, comes to power and he implements what's called the de-Stalinization program. I mean, you can see these pictures, they're literally even like taking down statues of Stalin. And the whole idea is to kind of erase his programs and the memory of his rule, seen as like too authoritarian. I mean, basically a dictator. It leaves a scar on the people of the Soviet Union, just the harshness of his regime. So Khrushchev's idea is to try to reinvigorate communist ideals, go back to kind of traditional values for them, and rely a lot more on that collectivist approach to rule, a lot less like, dictatorship centered. Now, you may be wondering, do these satellite states in the Soviet Union want the Soviet Union to be there? In a lot of cases, the answer to that is no. They're just not strong enough to kind of shake off the Soviet Union. So, one example of resistance to Soviet rule during this period is what's called the Prague Spring. So, there's this brief period of liberalization and reform in Czechoslovakia led by the Communist Party leader Alexander Dubček in kind of January to August of 1968. Now, he's really advocating for a lot of reforms. People are frustrated with the lack of freedoms that they have. There's a lot of censorship of speech and the press. They have a poor economy. Living conditions just aren't good. And so Dubček, he promises reforms that would make more socialism and democratic guiding principles rather than communist rule. And the Soviets respond really harshly to him and his regime. So the Soviet Union and the other Warsaw Pact countries, they're afraid that Czechoslovakia would be successful in reforming communism in a way that they don't want or approve. So they show that they will not tolerate this threat by sending in troops to shut down this movement. And I think this is important for kind of two reasons. I mean, well, we know it's not successful, but one, it shows the Western world that satellite states are not, happy with the way things are going all of the time. And it leads the Soviet Union to believe that it had the right to intervene in any communist country that was threatened. So that will play a bigger part kind of in their policies moving forward throughout the second half of the century. But by the kind of 1980s, we see that the Soviet Union is really starting to get tapped out. Their budget for things just isn't what it used to be. They still don't have the kind of like infrastructure needed to maintain these large empires spending kind of like they have been. And so there's leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev that are going to try to introduce new policies. So he has two specifically that are well known: Glasnost, which is a wider dissemination of ideas, like more openness to outside ideas, and Perestroika, the restructuring of economic policies. And this is where we start to see that the Soviet Union is kind of leaning against more traditional communist values because they see that it's not working for them. And a lot of these Eastern, satellite states, they see this and they start to reject communist rule and they try to leave the Soviet Union. And by 1991, the Soviet Union formally collapses as a government, even though it's been on the decline for years. And most of the countries that used to be Soviet satellite states will adopt some kind of democratic and capitalist policies. But there's going to be a lot of tension in those places for years. I mean, I would even say some today to come. And that leads us to, what are some of the lasting legacies of the Cold War? One of the most iconic images of the end of the Cold War is the fall of the Berlin Wall. While it happens 2 years before the Soviet Union itself as a government officially collapses, this really marks the true iconic image of the West and democracy and capitalism winning out. The people of Berlin literally tearing down the wall that separated them from their Eastern and Western counterparts. The other major impact is the creation of several new countries. So Czechoslovakia is going to be split up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. We see that Poland is going to be able to hold free elections starting in 1989. Yugoslavia is dissolved as well. And then the Balkans are going to kind of establish a bunch of different independent nations. And we'll see there's some problems and growing tensions there as well. Basically, a lot of the kind of ethnic tensions and different, regional variations of culture that existed before all of the wars are still going to exist after the wars. So that kind of concludes our thoughts on the Cold War. Thanks for watching.